Now what I'm interested in ultimately is looking at how this celestial architecture relates to the delivery of cosmic stuff to the Earth. That's where I'm ultimately interested in going with it. Is it possible, and that's why I started by showing you that connection between a probable encounter between Earth and a stream of cosmic debris that perhaps was being focused, somehow being focused along this alignment of the solar system that was the vernal equinox. Because, see, when we're looking at the vernal equinox up there, bear in mind, we're looking at one end of this axis, and the other end of that axis is the autumn equinox. And then at right angles to that is the solstitial line. And could we possibly go through now and set up the known timing of the various cosmic events, like if we assume, if we can take say the timing of the Burckle crater event and get that down to within a few years, the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations, which has been refined to within about, a decade or two of 4,300 years ago. If we could go to the collapse of the great ice sheets and the extinction event and the termination of the Pleistocene at 12,900 years ago, are we going to find similar things occurring? Will there be a consistent set of geometric patterns that might be associated with each of these events? And that's what I'm trying to explore. And so far what I'm finding suggests that there is some kind of a mechanism that seems to focus streams of cosmic material along certain pathways during certain epochs. And if we could know that information, that would be extremely valuable for future humans on this planet. Because without any question at all, and I brought something here tonight, it's about a year old, but it still needs to be addressed because we've been talking in here about the Holocene Working Group and the whole idea of global transformations, global changes, the emergence of the new catastrophism. This is basically from the work of the Holocene Working Group, which has been studying climate change and events for catastrophes since the Pleistocene ended 12,000 years ago, right? So we're now talking about events that are within the last 10,000 years. And this is what it says. In the presentation of the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dr. Benny Pizer of Liverpool, John Moores University, presented new evidence suggesting that more than 500 impact events of extraterrestrial origin have punctuated Earth during the last 10,000 years. Assuming that it is more, we'll be conservative and say 500. So that means, on average, every 20 years. Every 20 years. Now, when was the last time that we had a major impact? 100 years ago, 1908, although we now know that in the 1930s there might have been an equivalent impact event in Brazil that involved 3 objects causing massive blowdown of forest. We've seen evidence that 800 years ago there was a massive explosion over New Zealand that essentially decimated the animal life on New Zealand and flattened all of New Zealand's forests. The great majority, or 70% of these events, have been of the Tunguska type class of atmospheric impacts with an average energy yield of between 20 and 100 megatons of TNT. Now remember, for perspective, what was the largest hydrogen bomb ever tested by any human beings during the arms race? How much? 60 megatons. Now, if you dropped a 60 megaton bomb on downtown Atlanta, Sam's house would be knocked over by the energy of that. In fact, a 60 megaton bomb would completely wipe out the whole metro area of Atlanta and all of its suburbs. 160 megaton bomb. The estimated size of the Tunguska event was about 15 to 20 megatons, which is still one hell of an explosion. Because remember, it flattened 800 square miles of forest. And that would be the same as flattening 800 square miles of building. Think about an explosion that could flatten a single square mile, every building within it, right? Now think of an explosion that could flatten 800 square miles. That was the Tunguska event of 1908. 800 square miles of taiga forest, just laid over flat like it was matchsticks. Okay. However, more than 100 surface impacts, including more than a dozen oceanic impacts, are believed to have repeatedly devastated whole regions, small countries, and early civilizations around the globe. In a worst-case estimate, Dr. Pizer said that up to 8 climatic downturns detectable in the geological and climatological records of the Holocene may be directly associated with multiple impact events. Quoting him, episodes of increased cometary or meteoric activity punctuating societal evolution should be looked upon as potential agencies determining the rise and fall of ancient civilizations. Both the emergence and the collapse of human cultures, the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, and the Neolithic revolution, the onset and collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, and even the collapse of the Roman Empire may be associated with episodes of increased cosmic activity and multiple impacts that may well have included incidents of cosmic dust loading. While most of these impacts occurred over unpopulated areas of the globe, there are historical accounts about devastating cosmic catastrophes. According to a number of Chinese records, about 10,000 people were killed in the city of Xinjiang in 1490 AD due to the breakup of a small asteroid. About a dozen hypervelocity impact craters that date from the Holocene period since the end of the last ice age have been discovered to date. The majority of impacts, however, that occurred during this crucial period of societal evolution have not been detected yet. Now, I could go on here, but the implications of this are clear. Again, every piece of evidence, like since we started having these meetings 3 years ago, every piece of evidence since I started following this in the early 1980s with the discovery of the iridium layer has pointed to the same conclusion. That was what was once considered a totally wacko, oddball idea, that Earth was in any way affected by incursions of things from space, has now become essentially the bedrock idea of geology, even though the mainstream geologists have still not fully accepted the implications or are even aware of the implications yet. The reason being, geology, like so many scientific disciplines, is focused on some narrow avenue of research and hence tends to neglect the big picture. What I try to do is make up that deficiency by looking at the big picture. And the big picture has said, and all of the evidence is accumulating, that we have been in a period of cosmic quiescence or cosmic inactivity for the last couple of centuries that has been unprecedented through the whole of the Holocene, or the last 10,000 years. And that we should in fact be expecting that any time now a Tunguska class event should happen. In fact, I argue that we're overdue for it. Now, what happened in 1908 in Siberia didn't make much of an impact on societal evolution. But 100 years later, an impact of that event has a much greater probability of impacting a major population center. Now, if a Tunguska object happened over Europe, over America, over a densely populated area of India or China or anywhere like that, we're talking about an event that would produce probably casualties in the multiple millions, right? And again, the Tunguska event is a pea shooter event. It's a small cosmic event. And another thing is that, as I've tried to show you, is that that object was not just an isolated thing in space. It was part of a coherent system of stuff called the Taurid system that includes at least 2 known comets, 3 known asteroids, several different meteor showers, the Taurids, the Beta Taurids, the Aquarids, and several other objects out there. Possibly also the zodiacal light, which is basically a stream of dust. It's very possible that the climate of Earth could be drastically affected. In fact, of all the theories that could bring on an ice age, the one that seems to be the most consistent and accordable with the evidence is that a cosmic dusting is the agency by which an ice age is initially triggered. No, we don't like that. We don't like that, and here's the reason we don't like it, because we've probably, to use the words of the climate scientist John White, who first studied those Greenland ice cores I introduced you to a couple of years ago, made the statement verbatim, we don't know why we have been so blessed by this period of unprecedentedly stable climate that we haven't seen anywhere in the record. But we've had it, and it's allowed us to advance our culture and our civilization to this unprecedented level that we've achieved. And now we're becoming a globally integrated culture. But we're overdue for a cosmic catastrophe. In all of the religious and spiritual traditions of the planet that have this basis of catastrophism, and virtually all of them do, not only the myths and the legends of events that have happened in the past, but the prophecies of events that could happen in the future, because we're talking about a cyclical phenomena here. So if we're talking about something that happened once in the past, then absolutely we're talking about something that will happen again in the future. Just like if we're talking about spring equinoxes coming and it's going to be followed by a change in the weather, and then that's going to be followed by the summer solstice and then fall equinox and another change in the weather. Well, we're talking about changes in the cosmic weather that is cyclical. But in the cosmic cyclicity of things, what we find is that there are cycles of the energy and material composition of the cosmos that is fluctuating. It is not a steady state, it's fluctuating. So Earth, in its journey, in its cosmic journey, from wherever it started in the universe to where it ultimately is leading, passes through these discontinuities within the cosmic architecture, and when it does, it becomes much more vulnerable to having these transitions, transformations, and catastrophes imposed from the outside. Now, I argue that this has been ongoing for millions of years, and the biosphere finally is getting sick of it, and so it said, we've got to come up with a new species that can deal with this. Hence, human beings emerged onto the scene. And human beings came in and started immediately making all kinds of changes and upsetting the balance of things. But the balance of things that they were upsetting, as it turns out, is only an illusion, because there is no balance. The hardcore environmentalists want to take us back to some unknown ideal where everything was a certain way. Just prior to what, the Industrial Revolution? What do we want to go back to? When we say we want to limit carbon to the amount of carbon that was in the atmosphere in 1980, 1990, in 1850, 1,000 years ago, we want to return the Earth to the sea level of a century ago, the acreage of forests of a century ago, the amount of deserts. Do we think that we can somehow impose some kind of stasis on the planet and then that's going to be it, and we've returned the planet to some kind of pristine ideal? No, that is a complete delusion, because the planet has been changing severely and constantly since geological time began. We've come onto the stage at the very end of it, and we have built our society within a 2 or 3 century interval of unprecedented climate and environmental stability. And there is absolutely no reason why we should assume that this is going to continue indefinitely. And what we've done now is we've essentially perverted the whole equation by taking all of the emphasis and attention away from the natural cycles that have been ongoing for millennia and for millions of years, and focused exclusively on the effects of human beings, the anthropogenic effects. And so what is happening now? Last week in the paper, New York Times shows big science is now going to be getting on board with climate change. And that's one of the agendas of the new administration, to pump billions of dollars into climate change research. But I can tell you right now, the focus of that climate change research is going to be exclusively on anthropogenic climate change. And what's going to be neglected is the real issue, the stuff that's been ongoing since long before we stepped onto the stage and will continue long after we're gone. And the problem with it is that if we're focused on our own imprint, now I can tell you this, yeah, we have a carbon imprint, and we have an imprint on the environment, absolutely no doubt. There's no question about that. But the imprint that human beings have had basically disappears into complete insignificance when you look at the event that may have created Burkle Crater 5,000 years ago. There was an event that would have been, whose energy would have been equivalent to unleashing every nuclear weapon in the arsenals of the superpowers at the peak of the Cold War. Now, there is nothing, nobody can say, and I don't care who you are and what your beliefs are or what your attitude towards the environmental movement is. Nobody could say anything we have done yet approaches the effects of what we would have done to the environment had we had an all-out nuclear war. At one point, there was 10,000, 12,000 warheads in the arsenal, about 5,000 to 6,000 on each side. If we had let go with everything we'd had, what effects would that have had on the environment? The fires, the consequent, the dust injected into the atmosphere, the physical devastation caused by the blast waves and so on, it would have been devastating to the environment. But a full-scale, all-blown, 10,000 megaton nuclear war would be nothing compared to even a small asteroid impact, which has happened repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly throughout the history of the Earth, and has probably almost terminated the human species more than once. So what am I getting at here? I'm getting at the fact that all of this knowledge about our true position on this planet and within the cosmos is now available to us, but almost nobody gets it. Certainly nobody in Washington gets it. As they're planning to downsize NASA and shift the focus of NASA onto global warming, that signals to me loud and clear, nobody up there gets it. All right. So I don't want to end on a negative note.
Oh, no, it was great.
Because my point in all of this is we human beings are the one species on Earth that can figure all this out and understand what the stakes of the game really are. And as David Levy, co-discoverer of Shoemaker-Levy 9, said 10 years ago, he said, you know, there's many kinds of disasters have befallen the planet and human beings since culture began. Earthquakes, volcanoes, typhoons, hurricanes, massive forest fires, things. An earthquake, we have no hope of at this point anyway, technologically doing anything about an earthquake other than predicting it. Likewise, we have no way of controlling a volcanic eruption. I would like to be able to think that perhaps a century or two from now we could harness the energy of a volcanic eruption. But at this point, if a volcano decides to go off, it's going to go off and there's not a damn thing we can do about it. As David Levy went through the litany of different potential disasters that could befall the planet and as a consequence the human race, he said, of all of those, the worst disaster of all, and the one disaster that can cause all of the other disasters, is an impact. An impact can trigger gigantic earthquakes. It can trigger massive global volcanism. It can cause unbelievable climate changes and storms and hurricanes. It can create tsunamis of monstrous proportions, right? But ironically, and this is the irony of it, of all of those disasters that we can't do anything about, the worst disaster of all is within our control. We can do something about it. And we're as close now as a planetary civilization of doing something about the next planetary disaster as we were to putting a man on the moon in 1960. We may be closer, but nobody is looking. Nobody is heeding the message of the past from our predecessors on this planet who tried to put this insight into every conceivable format to transmit it down through the ages so that when the cycle came around again and the planet becomes vulnerable, whoever is alive at that time would be able to read the message of the past and heed the warning and say, okay, this is what's happened before, It's going to happen again. And the reason they've sent us this message is not because they believed that action was futile, but because they believed that we would be in a position to do something about it and protect the entire biosphere from the kinds of depredations that have repeatedly assaulted it throughout geological time. Of the 50 billion or so species that have ever lived on this planet, 99.999% estimate have gone extinct. And they have gone extinct because they have been annihilated in cosmic catastrophes. Now, we humans are in a very privileged position, but we're in a position of awesome responsibility because we are the caretakers of the planet. And it's not ourselves that we need to protect the planet from. Because unless we had upset the balance, probed the defenses of the opposition a little bit, we would be in no position whatsoever to even plan a counterattack. Am I right? You got to probe the defenses of your opposition, of the enemy. Now the enemy, though, is not each other. The enemy is an implacable cosmos that will throw this cosmic material at the earth, profoundly upsetting the balance of nature unless we intervene. This is the ultimate vindication of our technology, of our industry. We can use our science that we have conjured up to protect this planet. Think of the image of the knight slaying the dragon, protecting the beautiful maiden. That image that has been handed down to us from the Dark Ages, the chivalrous image, that's the image of man protecting the guardian of this planet. And that's our role, that's our responsibility. That's what nature wants from us. And if we do that, all the bad stuff we've done, essentially that will be like the ultimate karma balancer, if we do that. And all the bad stuff we've done to the planet, the raping and the pillaging of the planet that the environmentalists like to talk about, all of that, the slate will be clean, our karmic slate. But what's missing is the vision and the will. We've got to have the vision first, and then the will to do something. In 1960, there was a man, whatever his other faults and political beliefs were that I don't necessarily agree with, he did have a vision. And he said, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And he was killed, which was interesting, because had he not been assassinated, it's very possible that the space program wouldn't have carried that momentum through. But in the aftermath of his assassination, nobody wanted to stand up and say, hey, this is a boondoggle, and spending $60 billion putting a man on the moon is going to be a waste of money. But as it'll turn out, once we start talking in more depth about the moon and the mysteries of the moon, you'll understand why that Apollo program was so important. And that's the one of the few government programs that I, in retrospect, could be supportive of, was the program that put us on the moon. And even though maybe the motive for it was not the most noble, we wanted to beat the Russians there, nonetheless we got there. We brought back 800 and some pounds of lunar rocks. And those lunar rocks spoke to us. But what was their message? Well, that's going to be one of the things we're going to be talking about in the future, because that message of those lunar rocks pertained directly to the destiny of the human species in the next century or two. So there we'll leave it for tonight.